Good evening. I'd like to invite you to take your minds and your Bibles back to the book of Judges. I want you to think about the time period that Israel experienced during the time of the Judges. Israel had been given the land. They'd been given the land of Canaan, that led in by people like Moses and then taken all the way there by Joshua. They were given books of the law, things like the book of Leviticus, to give instructions to Israel to remain God's holy and faithful people in the midst of a very pagan people surrounding them. But this time, in the time of the period of Judges, we are introduced to a very, very dark time in Israel's history, a time when it's very chaotic, a time when a lot of bloodshed happens, a time when there is a whole lot of moral relativism. We want to see tonight that there are all kinds of problems with Israel at this time, but I want us to really consider passages that we find in the New Testament, Romans 6, verse 23, which says that the wages of sin is death. We live in a time period in which we see a lot of things that are very similar, and I hope to point that out tonight from what you see in the book of Judges. And do we really consider as God's people that the wages of sin is death? And if we do not take care of sin, if we have no solution for sin, if we continue in sin, it's just going to be some very, very dark times for us. But ultimately, it will lead in our downfall and in our death. The passage that was read tonight came from Judges chapter 16, and Samson is going to be one of the examples I want to look at tonight. But I want to notice here again with the context of Israel in the time of Judges. Number one, the problem that they had was an incomplete conquest of the land of Canaan. They were supposed to come in and drive out all of the peoples and to eliminate all of the peoples that were there in the land of Canaan. They had been judged by God, and because of their pagan and idolatrous practices, they were to be driven out and executed. But in Judges chapter 1, and you begin in verse number 27 through the end of the chapter, you notice that there was an incomplete driving out and conquering of that land. And so as a consequence, in Judges chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, God says, "You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you. But they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be snares to you." And again in Judges chapter 2, verses 20 through 22, it says that the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, "Because the nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. And so that through them, I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not." Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. There's a problem. They failed to follow the commands of God. This is transgression. There's consequences to their transgression. The second problem that you see reoccurring in the time of the book of Judges is found in Judges chapter 17 and verse number 6, and is also repeated at the end of the book in Judges 21 and verse number 25. The problem is there was no king at that time in the land. Now, I don't know if the writer of the book of Judges is referring to maybe Saul or David or Solomon, but there was no king at this time in Israel. But truly, the king should have been God. There was no king under Moses. They followed Moses' direction, who followed God. There was no king at the time of Joshua. They followed Joshua, who was following God. They didn't need a king because they had their heavenly king. There was a problem. There was no king in the land. There was no moral compass to put somebody at the forefront and say, this is the person to follow, whether or not everybody else, I'm going to follow that one. And then you see also in those same passages, Judges 17:6 and also Judges 21 and verse 25, it says that there was no king in the land at that time. And then it also says everybody did what was right in their own eyes. This was a time of moral relativism. And we need to understand this because I think when we really look through the lenses, we can see a time period that looks a whole lot like the time period we live in now. Who's the beacon of the guiding lights of the king sitting on the throne? It better be Jesus in our time period. And who is the one who gives the standard for what was said is right and what was said that is wrong in our time? And it better be the standard of the New Testament. Because if we fall into this trap of there's no king, and if we fall into the trap and say that we can just live out our lives and whatever you think is right for you, you do that, and whatever is right in my mind, I'll do that, we're going to have a very chaotic time. We're going to have a very dark time. And like I said, when I look out and I survey the world in which we live in today, I see a lot of similarities, and especially when it comes to the idea of the standard of right and wrong. What is sin and what is not? What is pleasing to God and what is not? But by the time you see Samson come on the scene, and you can turn in your Bibles to Judges chapter 13, by the time you see Samson come on the scene, he's the last of the judges. And there's this cycle of sin that is happening in this time where the people of God are rebelling. And because of their rebellion, they go into servitude of their enemies. They cry out to God, and God delivers them by way of the judge, and they serve as long as that judge is alive. But then when that judge dies, the cycle happens over again. And this cycle in the book of Judges is not only this way, but it's also a very downward spiral. By the time you get to the last judge mentioned in the book, Samson, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel as far as understanding what is right and what is wrong. There's a famine in the land of knowledge of what it means to do the things that God has said. And this cycle is something that I think we need to see and examine in our own lives. Let's take a look at Samson and just see what this man was all about. When my dad describes Samson, he describes him as the man with the $1 million body, but the 10-cent brain. You look at a man that the character flaws run deep. Notice in the beginning, look at Judges chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. Samson had problems, and one of his biggest problems was with women. Judges 14, verse 1. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. And so he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. And then his father and his mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of the brethren of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Samson had a problem. He couldn't find a good godly woman among his own brethren. And so he goes and finds a woman that he desires. And I don't think it had anything to do with the quality of person she was. And he says, Hey, Mom and Dad, go get her for me. That's real romantic as well. Samson had a problem. He had a problem of breaking God's laws. But Samson was supposed to be this chosen vessel that we see when we read in Judges 13. He was supposed to be given special commands of the things in which he was supposed to do with his life. He was supposed to be a Nazirite from birth. But you see, when you go through the laundry list of character flaws and defects in his life, he had no regard for what was right and what was wrong. The Israelites weren't supposed to take foreign wives. Not because there was something inherently wrong with women from another nation, but the reason why is because those women would take them away to serve their gods. Wealth and other things would flow out of Israel, not into Israel. There's a bride price that Samson had to pay for this woman of the Philistines. But his character flaws continue. Notice in Judges chapter 14, and look at verse number 8 and 9. We know of the VBS story of Samson tearing open the lion as if it were nothing. But as a Nazirite, he was not to come into contact with anything unclean. And a carcass of a dead body was something that he could not go near. Look in verse number 8. Now after some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. And he took some of it and handed it in his hand and went along eating it. And when he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. Was the law of the Nazirite vow something that was an option? No. I don't even see an appeal of this. This is a dead animal. And he says, I'm going to go get something to eat out of it. That's disgusting, even if it is honey. Sometimes you might want to go do a word search of honey in the Bible. There's sometimes when honey is a good thing and it's sweet to the taste, but sometimes it can also be an example of lustful behavior when you get out of control. And when you look at Samson as a character, he is someone that he likes those sweet things, and he is someone that is going too far with those things. And this is another example of him and not obeying the law of God. Continue reading in Judges chapter 14, verses 17 through 19. He finally gets this bride of the Philistines, and he tells a riddle to the companions, and he's going to get 30 garments out of it because he tells a riddle and they cannot solve it. But how do these companions go about solving it? They go through the woman in Samson's life. They get her to complain to Samson, to nag, to pick. And finally, after a week's worth of the complaining and the whining and the nagging, what does he do? He gives in and tells her. Just a bonehead. And they're able to solve the riddle. One of the, I don't know how to describe this verse, but it's something to be read. Look in Judges 14 and notice verse number 18, his response after they figure it out. He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So much for his loving bride to be and what he thinks about her. The character flaws continue. In Judges chapter 15, verses 7 and 8, he is going to take revenge on the Philistines who have done him wrong. And in Judges chapter 15, and starting with verse number 7, Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you. After that I will cease. And so he attacked them with the hip and thigh, and with a great slaughter. And he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Man who is willing to take revenge. Who's the one who's supposed to be holding the hands of revenge? Is it Samson that is the one who gets to deal out revenge? Or is it God? Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, isn't it? He didn't honor God's law. Continue reading in Judges chapter 16 and verse number 1. He is now going into one of the 5 major cities of Philistia, and he's going way into their country, a wanted and known man, all because he's got his heart set on a harlot. Now, I don't think there's anything to do with marriage. I don't think there's anything to do with anything righteous. But he had to have her. And he's almost captured in that situation. But in the morning before they could come and get him, he tears the doorpost off and runs over 30 miles with them. Then after that, you see him with his biggest blunder of them all. And it is with the original gold digger, Delilah. And in the verses that you see with Delilah, Delilah has no love for this man, only the financial gain that she can get from getting his strengths out of him. And so time after time after time, he goes through this game with her. And I don't really understand, because it doesn't ever tell us why he continues to keep giving up his secret. Because he goes through it 4 times. How many times do we got to go through this cycle where we know that this woman doesn't have the best interest in mind for him, and yet he still gives in to her? I don't know if it's pride. I don't know if it's arrogance. But at the very end, you see those verses that were read by Brother David tonight. And so this cycle, and this cycle where Samson just thinks, I'm going to get out of anything, as he had in the past. But I haven't been honoring anything that the Lord has ever done or commanded me to do. And at the end of his time, it says that the Lord wasn't with him. Notice in Judges chapter 16 and look at verse number 20. When Delilah knows that Samson has told her finally the truth after the 4th time, and his head shaven, and she says, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And so he awoke from his sleep and said, I'll go out as I did before at other times, and I will shake myself free. When the lion came upon him, he was able to get out of that. When the Philistines are coming at him, when they're trying to arrest him, he breaks the ropes and he gets a jawbone of a donkey, and he's able to get out of that one. When he's almost dead and dying, and he's dying of thirst, the Lord opens up a rock and brings forth water for him, and he's delivered out of that one. He's delivered out of the hands of the city of Gaza when he had done wrong. So I'm just going to keep doing the same thing that I'm doing, and I'm just going to keep getting the same deliverance as I've always gotten. Verse number 20, it says, But he didn't know that the Lord had departed from him. How very sad a state of a man who was lured to sleep by a horrible woman of Delilah, shaved, and his strength no longer with him, and he doesn't even know that he's done something wrong. But when I look at Samson and I think about the cycle that he was in, I really see a microcosm of what it was for the Israelite nation. When you think and consider your Old Testament and the cycles of sin that they go into themselves, even during the time of Moses, we talked about this. Hiram put up on the slide, there was 12 different times that he counted of rebellion in the wilderness. That these people, that they had, there was the commands that God had given them, and they decide, well, I'm just going to do it my way. It's not very convenient to do it your way, God. I'll just do it my way. And you see a very, very similar situation with the nation as a whole. You see a special people chosen by God. You see a particular set of laws and commandments that they were to keep themselves special and holy for God's purpose. But then you see over and over and over, Israel rejects God. And Israel plays the harlot with other people. Turn in your Bibles to the book of Ezekiel. And I want you to see in the book of Ezekiel chapter 16, I want you to see the contrast between God's love and the things in which He's done for Israel, and then the complete disregard and turning away. And to give you the context, Ezekiel is in Babylon in captivity. He's part of that first wave that is taken off, and he's by this river in Babylon. And in the first couple chapters, you see the presence of the Lord has now left Israel and come to Babylon. You say, well, isn't God supposed to be in Israel? Isn't He supposed to be in Jerusalem? Isn't He supposed to be with the temple? But when you examine the first about 11 chapters of the book of Ezekiel, the temple of God has been desecrated. They brought in idols from other places. And so now Lord Jehovah stands among one of many that the Israelites bow down to. And so because the Israelites had left God, God had left His people. And He had gone to, maybe we can find some faithful people among the captives that might be repentant. And so in Ezekiel chapter 16, you see the state of Israel and the love in which God showed. Notice in verse number 4, as for your nativity, on the day when you were born, your navel was cut, or your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water to be cleansed. You were not rubbed with salt or wrapped in swaddling clothes. No eye pitied you to do any of these things for you, to have compassion on you, but you were thrown out into an open field when you yourself were loathed on the day in which you were born. That was Israel's sorry state. But then you see God in verse number 6, and when I passed by you and I saw you struggling in your own blood, I said to you in your blood, live. Yes, I said to you in your blood, live. I made you thrive like a plant in a field. And you grew and matured and became very beautiful. Your breasts were formed and your hair grew, but you were naked and bare. And when I passed by you again and saw and looked upon you, indeed your time was the time of love. And so I spread my wing over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore in an oath to you and entered into a covenant with you and became mine, says the Lord God. I washed you in water. Yes, I thoroughly washed off the blood, and I anointed you with oil. I clothed you in embroidered cloth, and I gave you sandals of badger skin. I clothed you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I adorned you with ornaments and put on bracelets on your wrists and a chain upon your neck. And I put a jewel in your nose and earrings in your ears, and it was a beautiful crown upon your head. Notice all the love which God had poured out on Israel. And God made those covenants long ago to people like Abraham, to people like Isaac and Jacob. It wasn't because Israel was some great nation that God chose them. But notice in chapter 16, Ezekiel is about to drop the hammer on the sins and the wickedness of Israel. Verse number 15, you trusted in your own beauty and played the harlot because of your fame, and poured out your harlotry on everyone passing by who would have it. And you can continue reading some of the other language that Ezekiel uses. You continue in verse 31, it says, you erected your shrines at the head of every road and built your high places in every street. Yet you are not like a harlot because you scorn payment. You are an adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband. Men make payment to all harlots, but you made your payments to your lovers. Instead of getting paid for what they did, they paid the other people. And it continues on. And the state of Israel will be taken fully away into Babylonian captivity. A blessed people, chosen by God, given specific instructions that were thrown aside, and they're just going to do whatever it is that they want to do. So they reap the consequences of their actions. And when I think about Israel and I think about Samson, I need to think about holding the mirror to my own life. And I need to see and reflect on the things in which God has given me. And do I live like the world? Do I live like the world and say, well, as long as it suits me, God, I'll do what you say. But when it comes to that sticky situation, that tough time when everything's on the line, I might be justified in doing a little bit of wrong. Oh, it's just one little thing. It's not going to hurt in the grand scheme of things. Sin is a serious, serious thing. We need to see it for how serious it is. Romans 6 and verse 23 says, the wages of sin, if I continue in sin, if I practice sin, if I disregard what God has said, the wages of sin is death. You see it in the death of Samson, when he thinks that in my pride and my arrogance, I'll just get out of it like I always do. God's always going to be there for me, as he always is. He didn't realize his whole life he had been trying to push God away. Now God wasn't there to deliver. In the same way with Israel, special people and given these things, I'm just going to push God away, and I'm just going to keep getting out of it. We're just going to keep flourishing as we've always done. If we get in trouble, we'll call down to Egypt or we'll call up to Assyria. They'll bail us out. And finally, they are delivered into captivity for 70 long years, for a generation to pass, that they can finally understand sin is a serious problem. We live in a very similar situation today. We live in a culture and a climate that says you can do whatever you want to do. Whatever the situation calls for, just go and do it. If you're pregnant at the time in which is not convenient for you, it's all right. You can have a baby later on. If we live in a culture and a climate that says whatever you want to make is right, and whatever you want to say is true, you do it your way. God is not a person that operates in relative terms. His standard has been set forth by his holy men as they wrote, as inspired by the Holy Spirit. And a question that comes to us in Romans chapter 12 and verse number 2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, are we really living this out? Because the world wants to put us into a mold and a shape and say, everybody slips up from time to time. It's okay. Sin's not this big problem. If I just tell one little white lie, it's not going to make too much of a difference. Did it make a difference doing right or wrong for Samson? And the standards in which God held him to? Did it make a difference for Israel and the standards for which they were to be held to? Have we been transformed to the better way of life? Fully transformed, converted Or are we settling for being conformed into the ways of this world? Turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 3. There's a couple different places I like to look in Hebrews. We've been studying this on Wednesday night. I encourage you to come back to these verses. In Hebrews chapter 3, starting verse number 12 through 15, it says, "Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief, departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it's called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end." How do we be truly converted? We need to see and recognize the deceitfulness of sin. Sin will try to tear you down and look for those small chinks in the armor that it says, well, we can just get one little one in. And after time, if I keep hitting that hole and keep hitting that hole and keep hitting that hole, we might just blow it wide open. And that's what happens when we let sin become a small or trivial thing. But it says, exhort one another daily. Encourage one another. Why do we come together? To encourage one another, to put on that full armor of faith. We sharpen one another. We find weak spots. And we strengthen those together. Continue reading in Hebrews chapter 4 and look in verse number 1 and 2. It says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any one of you seem to have come up short. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it." How do we continue to be truly converted? The things in which we hear, the things in which we study and read about in our Bible. Do we just have it for head knowledge that we can do good on memorizing cards? It needs to be mixed with faith. And those people in the wilderness, when they heard the things which they were spoken by Moses, it wasn't mixed with faith. And so they weren't able to go into that rest. The rest still remains for us. We have not yet achieved that rest. So we need to continue on until the end. And then notice in Hebrews chapter 4 and look at verse number 11 through 13. "Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. For the word of God is living and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of the soul and the spirit, and of the joints and the marrow, and a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account." We need to let this do the work on us. God's word is living and powerful. And it's going to shine its light, piercing into every little part of your life. The actions are easier to be seen. A lot of times it's easier to hide away those thoughts that are in our minds. Scripture penetrates even that. And if we hold something back and we say, well, this is just a little bit of a pet sin, and I know I struggle with it, but I'm just going to keep holding on to it, and it's not a big problem. I have it under control. Did Samson have it under control? Did Israel have it under control? And what makes us think that we can have it under control? If I keep bringing fire into my belly, I'm going to get burned. And if I'm not serious about sin in my life, the reward is death. And so, in conclusion tonight, when we see that the wages of sin is death, we must take it serious. We must learn the lessons from Samson. We need to learn the lessons from Israel, and we need to look and examine our own lives to make sure that we have rooted out sin in our lives. James chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 says, in all things we need to submit to God and resist the devil. And when we resist the devil, what happens? He's going to flee from us. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, purify your hearts. This is the solution that we need to see in our own lives. Even we who have put on Christ in baptism, if we will no longer listen to the things which God has said, and we walk away from Him, He's not going to deliver us. And so the invitation is extended to those who have walked away. To those who have been in a cycle of sin so long in their lives, it's just become second nature. I beg you, I plead with you, come back. Because the wages of your lifestyle is going to lead to your death. The invitation is also extended for those who are struggling. Somebody tonight who is struggling with a particular sin that they're holding on to and they're fighting for their lives. And they know that they need to get rid of it, but they need to find the exit off of that circle. And you need the prayers of the church for strength to fight against it, to overcome. The prayers of a righteous man avail much. And finally, the invitation is also extended for those who maybe you've never been exposed to a better way. Sin and the cycle of sin in your life has gotten you nowhere. And ultimately, if you're honest with yourself, you know that sin and that sin in your life is leading to death. The invitation is for you as well to confess that you have sinned, to confess Jesus is going to be the directing line of my life. He's going to be Lord. He's going to set the standard for how to live. To go down into baptism, to wash away those sins, to come up to a new life, free from those things, to walk in paths of righteousness that Jesus will show us. Remain faithful until the end, until that rest is received. Tonight, if the invitation is something you need to respond to, it is offered. Please come as we stand and as we sing.